notes that we have to answer this week, and then I guess it goes off to the presses.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to that. I just want to remind everybody, feel free to use the chat here on Zoom to chat amongst yourselves. If you have a question for us, put it in the Q&A box. I see there's already a couple parked in there that we'll hit at some point. And if you're watching this on the YouTube broadcast, we're not engaging with the chat on there. So there you're just free to chat amongst yourself. And let us get rolling. I just thought as the description of this panel was that Dracula authorities, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with being in the authoritative chair, but okay. Dracula authorities pull back the curtain and discuss the origins of the most famous vampire. So let's start with Stoker's origins, I guess, and how he came to write the novel. Either one of you want to go first?
I'll let David do it. He's the one that just finished that wonderful biography, Something in the Blood, so he can talk about this at length.
Well, Stoker was interested in folklore from a very, very early age. Probably the first reading materials he had were chapbooks of Irish of folk legends when he was growing up in Dublin, and he was drawn from the very beginning, I think, to the fantastic and the supernatural. He went to Trinity College Dublin, and he graduated. What was year? 1872? Did he find?
I think so.
Yeah, the same year that Sheridan Le Fanu published Carmilla, which I'm sure he saw at the time. Le Fanu was the greatest current literary celebrity in Dublin, although he was really near the end of his career and his life in 1872. But there are so many correspondences between Carmilla and Dracula that we know he read it carefully, and I have no doubt that he read it as soon as it came out. So in that sense, the seeds were sown, as a very young man. We don't know precisely when he started. We do have some dated notes, but that doesn't tell us the whole story.
Yeah,
he was scribbling, in his Dublin days. I mean, he wrote all the short stories that became his children's book, Under the Sunset. And I've seen the manuscript, and he wrote on any scrap of paper that he could find, and it's a real kind of a jumble of things. But it was what he did. So we don't know how early he started thinking about the vampire. We know he saw a burlesque ballet called The Vampire when he was a drama critic in Dublin, and it was knocking around in the back of his mind. I think his inspirations were literary. I think some of the claims that have been made for the idea of an Irish vampire legend are a little strained, and I don't quite, including where the name Dracula came from. I think we can rule that out.
You mentioned
right away, but
I was going to say, you mentioned a date. The earliest date in the notes is March 8th, 1890 on one particular note. There's a few of the notes that have dates, but very few. So as far as the record, we at least know that there was 7 years that he was developing, writing out ideas and plot, ideas and outlines and things like that. But you're certainly right that it seems to go far back in his reading, because he draws on so many other works, not just Carmilla, but even others, in putting his.
There's the character of Count Dracula has many similarities to the character of Uncle Silas in the novel of the same name by Le Fanu. We really do know he liked that. He told his son that it was a great novel and he ought to read it. And the descriptions of the ancient Uncle Silas, completely dressed in black, this cadaverous villain was quite in keeping. We know that he read Gothic novels, things like The Italian and the Mysteries of Udolpho and many others. And there we find all these villains who sound an awful lot like his description of Dracula. I mean, he lifted some stuff verbatim. He doesn't seem to have really cared where he pulled things from. I mean, Shakespeare did the same thing. I wouldn't call it plagiarism, but these things had kind of fallen into the general vocabulary of literature. And we do know, just because of the number of parallel scenes and characters, that he was well acquainted with a penny dreadful novel called Varney the Vampire that came out the year he was born, actually. So, and then was published later in book form. And I have no doubt that there was a dog-eared copy of that book in his collection. We have to speculate about a lot when we're talking about Bram Stoker, and I think that's why he's always going to be a very interesting character, because there are so many mysteries about him. He just didn't tell us about himself.
Yeah.
And I think what I've tried to do in my writing is kind of separate speculation that's reasonable and kind of grounded in fact, and from the opposite. And I'm working on, I worked for many years on my biography of Stoker called Something in the Blood. And in the 4 years since it's come out, there have been many more discoveries, some my own that I haven't published yet. I'm gonna revise the book once, and that is going to be the end of it. And I will be happy to let other people research and speculate. And I think I'm done when I've made him into a really good story, and I think he's almost there. And but it's crazy when you publish a book immediately the week after it comes out, you're contacted by people through your publisher. Oh, did you know this detail? Did you know about this biographical thing or this document? And no, of course you didn't. And so I have quite a stack of things to incorporate, but just once. And then I hope somebody will do him again from the ground up someday. I know I could have, if I had an unlimited budget, I would have gone about this in a very, very different way. And there are still things to be uncovered in Dublin. And if you're nice to me, maybe I will give you a little roadmap of things I think you might look for. I'll leave it to somebody. There will be.
He's throwing the gauntlet down for you, John, I think.
Okay. And I would just add to what David said, that the story that is Stoker is very true. It is a really remarkable, very interesting and intricate story. And obviously David's right. The vampire was definitely floating around and fermenting in his psyche and subconscious through those years where he was writing and going to plays and reviewing plays. But it really helped when he started working for Irving. And definitely from 1885 onward, we start seeing Faust being performed. It was their biggest show at the Lyceum Theater. Stoker obviously saw in Irving this potential for being this vampiric figure. I mean, especially in Faust, there are bats in Faust. There was even a musical score called The Vampire that was in some of the first runs that was eventually taken out of the program. And there were even these ape-like figures in the play, which we eventually will see in some of the early foreign translations in the Swedish and Icelandic. But I think it took.
Oh yes, Faust was well represented in what I think was his first draft of the book. That that's a long story to get into.
Yes,
integrating that into my narrative is another problem. I'm just going to have to kind of stop and tell the reader we're going to flash forward here.
Yeah,
and because it's quite possible that an early draft of Dracula was published after the novel came out. was published in a pirated kind of way.
Yeah.
But that's a story that's it's good. I think the first English publication will be within the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And I have a few insights into that, and it's going to shake up a lot of. I'm not sure. I don't share the same interpretation of the manuscript that the translators and editors who are working on it do, but I still think everybody should go read it and make up their own
Absolutely.
mind.
Speaking of the Faust connection, I know Dacre's talking tomorrow at Monsterama at 2:30. He's doing a Stoker on Stoker presentation, and he really goes into the whole Devil Faust connection with Dracula in that. So you can all tune in and watch Dacre tomorrow. I just wanted to add too that, you know, as far as the evidence goes, because we have the notes at the Rosenbach that I mentioned, the 7 years worth of notes that he put together. But also there is, and this is where it gets a little confusing, because it's not a manuscript that we have at the Rosenbach. There is a manuscript for the novel. I tend to call it a typescript, because it's a typed version of the novel with annotations by Bram Stoker and his brother. And I'm not sure, there might even be another hand in it. I forget, David. Do you know? Is there more than
There is at least one unidentified bit of handwriting in it. Yeah.
So, and that exists, and that's at the Seattle Museum of Popular Culture, and that seems to be the last version that he had produced. But what always fascinates me is that, especially according to the notes and all the different ways and the different ideas that he had, that he kept repeating, that, boy, there must have been multiple drafts of this novel, especially the early part of the novel. He really must have drafted different versions with different things, and it's gone.
Yeah,
we haven't found it yet.
the Seattle typescript is thought to be the typesetter's manuscript, and because there are so many differences between it, it means there was one set of printer's proofs that were edited by Stoker. A number of things were taken out, and they have been since referenced in Les Klinger's annotated version, and I did get to see the manuscript myself, and I have some notes of my own in there, and it's a most of his books came out of him in a torrent. Dracula was different. He had trouble figuring out exactly what he wanted to do with it, and there are a whole slew of clues as to what on. I think from the very beginning, what we can say safely is that he wanted to have a big commercial success with a book. He didn't, in my research, I found strong evidence that he really didn't negotiate the terms of his employment at the Lyceum Theater as well as he could. I think he was always strapped for money, and to support his wife and his child, he had to have other sources of income. He even went and studied for the bar. He thought he might be a barrister, on the side. He never actually, but it was he was this unbelievable volcano of energy. But I think it's safe to say there were versions of Dracula we haven't seen.
Yeah,
I think he may have done finger exercises, as far back as his Dublin days, and his widow did not preserve everything he had. His son said that in their home there was a full room that was filled from floor to ceiling with his diaries and journals and notebooks during the whole period that he was working for Henry Irving. and that's all gone except for the handwritten manuscript of his Irving biography, which reveals some wonderful additional biographical details on Stoker. He wanted to have this creative fusion with Irving, who he just idolized, and didn't get it in life, but in death he wormed his way into the book as a character himself. But that's it. What happened to all of this? What happened to the massive amount of correspondence he must have had with his good friend Hall Caine, who was a best-selling novelist? I mean, he approached Dickens in his kind of popularity at the time. Nobody remembers him today. You really have to be a diehard Dracula person to
and know that Dracula, the Hami Beg, is Hal Caine that it's dedicated to.
It's him, but they were just touted as intimate friends over over decades, and they lived quite a ways apart. They weren't texting each other and having Zoom conversations. There were letters, and I found a whole, I guess about 80 of them. Some of them are still not. His handwriting is really just.
It's really hard. Yeah,
it's atrocious because I think you can't read his handwriting because he couldn't keep up with his thoughts, and it becomes almost like a personal kind of shorthand, and you find this all the time looking at Victorian correspondence and say, how did people know what each other were, right? What words they were trying to make? I mean, somehow they did it, but and of course they were immersed in cursive handwriting in a way that we aren't today, and so there were probably all kinds of nuances that.
I also think too that we're surprised that all his documents weren't saved and all these letters weren't collected, but even his wife, people did not consider him to be a kind of great writer worth saving. And it's only been the last few decades that there's been real academic study of Stoker. So I wonder if that's part of it too, that there may be materials, especially letters out there, but none of it was collected. And now it's 100 years later, and it's hard to find out where all of it is.
It's fascinating. Florence Stoker married a writer, and no correspondence, let alone love letters, have surfaced. I think there may have been a couple of telegrams and things, scraps of things. She did, however, carefully preserve her full correspondence with Oscar Wilde, who was who got thrown over for Stoker, and I think he was seemed like the steadier ship, for marriage.
As he was.
Yeah, Wilde, when she knew Wilde, he was still a student, making a lot of waves up at Oxford, but had no real employment possibilities, and his family's finances were just. It was not a marrying into the Wilde family would not have been a catch. It would have been a lot of debt, actually. So, and I think she regretted it later in life. But anyway, I'm doing a screenplay adaptation of Something in the Blood that I'm going to have to make some fictional decisions, because you can't just say, well, it might have been this, it might have been that. No, you have to write dramatic scenes and have people speak in declarative sentences and make their intentions known. And so I'm going to have it both ways. I have a biography, and I'm going to have a story.
Ooh, good.
And that's it. I've been maybe too involved in Dracula for too much of my life, and there are a few other things I'd like to accomplish.
David, here's an interesting tidbit, because I know you and I, when we've made copies of Stoker's letters and we've written above each of his words what the word is in our own handwriting. I've had access to one of Irving's letters, and above each of Irving's words, because his handwriting wasn't much better, is Stoker writing what each word was. So I imagine Stoker thought the same thing about Irving that everyone else thinks about Stoker now.
And it's like I said, Victorian handwriting is you practically need a Rosetta Stone or something. It's nobody's written about this, about the peculiarities of cursive handwriting and correspondence. And
this change is happening again now because there is a younger generation that does not, read cursive. And I've had fellow teachers talk to me about this and how they have students who can't read cursive now. I mean, very young, and they don't know how to read it. It's like it's the old script. It's the ancient rules for them.
But in terms of an academic subject, it's been neglected.
Yeah,
and it's a fascinating cultural story that I hope somebody digs into sometime.
John, let's move on to another topic thing we had put down here. Stoker's research and sources, especially including how past vampire fiction and folklore may have influenced him. You want to start us off on that?
Well, sure. I mean, when I'm teaching Stoker, I'm teaching Dracula, which I'm doing right now, actually, at SCAD, my students become so fascinated in how much they think Stoker created for the vampire mythology. And indeed, he did add his own touch to it, especially the integration of so much Christian sacramentals and crosses and holy water. I imagine you saw some of that in vampire mythology where people were exhuming bodies and such, but it wasn't as readily talked about or made as prevalent as it is in Dracula. But all the other stuff he took from various sources that he used, including quite a bit from Emily Gerard and her some of her writings, which eventually became The Land Beyond the Forest, which I have a copy of. My students were always so surprised by how cliche Dracula is. And I'm like, no. He was the beginning of the cliche. Everything's cliche because of him. And they often think that there are other things that started with him, like this vampire being this aristocrat. And I'm like, no, you have to go back even further to around 1820 or so with John William Polidori and the vampire. And there you see kind of the first Edward Cullen. You see this very attractive, suave vampire, and that kind of thing begins to eventually diminish over time. You do see a few female vampires popping up, as in Carmilla, but over time through the 19th century, Dracula and vampires in general become kind of dirty old men, and Dracula is definitely the king of these dirty old men. I wish in the novel, after he drank more blood and became younger and younger, he became something a little more like something that women could imagine themselves being with. But I think that would have just been well beyond Stoker's, sense of propriety, especially since he probably had in his subconscious that this was Irving. So maybe that would have been too much of his subconscious coming out if he made Dracula become young and virile enough to where women found him, irresistible.
How about the story of the mysterious stranger? Do you ever wind up using that to show how? Because there's so many parallels in the mysterious stranger. I
always debated whether to have my students read Dracula, then have them read The Mysterious Stranger. But instead, I have them read everything before Dracula, so that by the time they get to Dracula, they're like, oh, wow. So that my class that just reads Dracula, they think Dracula is really cliche. But when the class that's on vampire literature history, when they get to Dracula, they're like, oh, my gosh, Stoker took so much from the vampire, Polidori, took so much from Varney, and also a lot from The Mysterious Stranger. I mean, that was essentially the prototype. Although there's an interesting thing. I'm in the process of translating the original German Mysterious Stranger. And one interesting thing is it's set in the Carpathian Mountains. And it actually in the German version, it's in Styria, which is fascinating because that's where Stoker initially said. Yes.
And so that version we've been reading for years, because you people may have this, it's The Mysterious Stranger, and it used to be, say, anonymous and from a certain year. And we now know there was a German version called Der Fremd by Karl Aschmann. And And I didn't realize that part of that. So that's an old Victorian translation we're reading.
Yeah.
And in that they changed Styria to Carpathia, huh?
Yeah. And I'm only through about 3 pages because it's written in that particular German script that unless you're used to that, even Germans today can hardly read it. It's bizarre. But my scholar friend who's in the process of doing some of it, he told me that and I was like, whoa. And that's in the first page. So what else did they change in the English translation?
It's really amazing. It had the vampire as presented is much more like 20th century movie vampires than Stoker's character was, and it was the screenwriter for the Langella version of Dracula actually picked one of Klotka, the vampire's name's quips for Langella, where he kind of warns Kate Nelligan about be careful what you ask for if you'd like me to be a friend, because some people have difficulty shaking me off. And he says everything except I never drink wine. And it's all there. And I wonder if Garrett Fort, who did the screenplay for the 1931 film, read The Mysterious Stranger, because Lugosi's lines about wine and to die, to be really dead, all this sardonic humor, it came way back in that story, The Mysterious Stranger.
Yeah.
How's the line? Be careful, or I ask you to take care, for an acquaintance who forces himself, but is difficult to be rid. Although in The Mere Stranger, it's difficult to shake off. So I like to get a little bit more finesse in the screenplay.
You mentioned Emily Gerard, and he certainly pulled a lot from her. It seemed to be only from her. Well, I used to teach Dracula, and that he pulled it only from her article, Transylvanian Superstitions, that she had published. But he clearly had read the book as well, because he pulls a few items that are from the book into it. And now I think Lockie Heiss has done some work and has looked at the copy that's in the London Library, and they look suspiciously like the same kind of marks Bram Stoker was putting in other books. But from Gerard, he gets that blue flames that reveal the treasure, and he gets this great kind of arcane stuff about vampires. And this is actually a quote from his notes. Vampire or Nosferatu. To kill vampire, drive stake through corpse, or fire pistol shot into coffin, or cut off head and replace in coffin with mouthful of garlic, or extract heart and burn it and strew ashes over grave. They're his notes from Gerard. And that's almost exactly what Van Helsing says. So he's really mining that, not only folklore, which we have a record of, which is nice. I just wish we had a record for all the fiction that he was pulling from, because he clearly did. Polidori and Varney and Carmilla and Mysterious Stranger. And those books and stories were likely in his library that Florence just didn't bother to send off to auction. Imagine if we still had his copies of those left, would be really great.
Yeah, a lot of it was sold and given away long before that auction, according to his son, who reported all the
himself gave it away, or Florence, you mean?
He didn't get into the details, but he said, their previous home, the one before Stoker's final residence, was just jammed full of books, and these were clearly not. He's not describing the ones that Florence. But no, he was a bookworm. I mean, he just inhaled literature the same way he exhaled prose. He was. And, anyone want to take on the word Nosferatu? My thinking keeps evolving on it.
Yeah, because it used to be everyone thought he got it from Emily Gerard, but it's not clear where she got it from because it's not in the language. But now we know it's actually earlier than that there was a German scholar whose name is escaping me. You guys will know, right?
Before and after, there were several. There are at least 3 or 4 sources where, in German sources, the word Nosferatu appears. It's not a German word. It doesn't get us any closer to the thing. But so Emily Gerard may have seen it from one of those sources. May have not. I think it bears a strange. It's too close to the Romanian adjective nesuferit, and if you personalize it with which is what the letter U at the end of Romanian words do, nesuferitu sounds a hell of a lot like, and it would mean the plaguesome one, or the thing to be shunned, or whatever. But God, it's really a mystery, and it is not in any formal dictionary or folklore lexicon. It appears in a few essays about folklore, and we just don't know. But Stoker made it so famous, and it sounds so ancient and creepy that it's pretty convincing. So
yeah,
it is now. Now it is the word for for a vampire.
The next word on it, I think, will come from Lockie. He's actually doing quite a bit of research on it, and I don't know.
He's a fantastic researcher.
Yeah, and he's telling me some about it, and I haven't been able to get back to him, but I have no doubt that he'll be the next person to sort of advance some new research on the word's origins.
He shared some things with me that really just kind of smacked me awake.
Yeah,
and I don't know what shape he's going to give it to finally, but I'd love to see him do his own book, and
absolutely
lay claim to it.
Would be great. He's one of our regulars in Sundays with Dracula, and it's so great having him in the chat to give especially his medical expertise on all these issues that come up in the book. David, I wonder if you want to talk too about, one of the things I think is such a huge influence on Stoker and vampires in general is not just the literary we've been talking about, the folklore, but stage vampires. I kind of feel like people in Stoker's time and Stoker himself were just as likely and more likely for some people to be familiar with a stage vampire than they were with a literary one.
Oh, yes. And I think, Stoker was probably very well aware of these incarnations as well. Polidori's story, The Vampire, A Tale, was adapted very quickly. Within like a year of its publication, it started there. There were melodramas, stage melodramas. They were pirated. They weren't licensed or permitted. In those days, there was no such thing as a dramatic copyright.
They weren't really pirated because you could just do that.
Yeah, they just went to town with it. And so we saw both. We saw things in England, and we saw things on the continent, especially in France. And it became the basis of Marschner's opera Der Vampir, which people don't appreciate was really a standard part of the operatic repertoire in the 1800s. It was one of the most produced plays, operas in Europe, and so the stage, both musical and merely speaking, did, and then of course we do know there was at least one burlesque dance version called The Vampire, where I don't think it had anything to do with Polidori, but and Stoker was a man of the theater, and there is so much theater in Dracula. He makes many very overt references, some nudging little winks and in jokes about the Lyceum and people he knew there. The character of Jonathan Harker is named for Joseph Harker, the scene painter at the Lyceum, who did all of those fantastic trompe-l'oeil drops that they used in place of three-dimensional scenery. Another difference in the theater that we don't totally appreciate, but it was the only way for people like Irving to travel the world. You had to have scenery you could roll up, and Um, Otherwise, and the Lyceum is such a. I'm just on a. It's now the home of the Lion King, which has been playing there, and it was completely renovated the interior several times, but the house is still there. The auditorium is still there, and I went over to the stage door and I said, "Hey, I'm an American writer, and I'm doing something about Bram Stoker and Henry Irving, and I've never seen the theater. Could you could somebody take me in?" And they were so happy to do so. I can't imagine American stage managers, stage door personnel, being so accommodating. But they had all kinds of questions about what I was doing, and they let me take pictures. They said, just don't point it at the big Lion King logo or anything like that, but the rest is ours, and you can do it. But it's a huge proscenium, and the idea that Irving performed Shakespeare in this cavernous space really tells you that there was he was supposed to be a naturalistic actor, at least for the time. I mean, he was also supposed to be quite a ham. But how you fill that state, what kind of vocal power do you have? What it really makes you rethink a lot of things you think about theater and how plays are staged. It would, and then I try to think of Stoker's little staged reading of the play, which must have been at a single lectern, because he didn't do all these cut and paste versions, for each cast member. And they would have been like little specks, little ants on this gigantic piece of theatrical real estate, reading Dracula. But it was read out loud there, every word of it, apparently.
Yeah, this is the reading that he put together to retain the copyright, that he cut and paste a version of his Dracula that then they did a staged reading of.
There's no evidence that these staged readings really did protect anything. And he did it, of course, for reasons of vanity and the fact that he wanted Henry Irving to play Dracula, which he had no interest in doing. It would have been a terrible part for Irving, except for the figure he cut in his Mephistopheles robes. I mean, he looks a lot like Lugosi in the familiar movie, but he wanted attention. Irving was in the spotlight. In Stoker's story, Dracula is not. He is somebody you hear about. He has a few good scenes, and most of the time, though, people are anticipating him or worrying about him or fearing him, but he's not interacting with characters in the way he would come to in many of the adaptations. Finally, the idea that he had to be transformed into a presentable character, not this smelly old man, and could ingratiate himself in polite society, became a standard part of the Dracula legend that Stoker did not imagine at all.
I want to throw that to you in a second, John. I just want to remind everybody, as Anthony put in the chat, that Monsterama and SpyCon are brought to you this year for free, virtually, so you can enjoy. But they're asking if you could please donate to the Motion Picture Television Fund. If you're watching this on Zoom, the link is there in the chat. You can also go to the virtual Monsterama site and find the link to that, and please donate.
Yeah, I will. If I can second that, I posted on Facebook a message to my followers that yes, this was going to be free, but without the Motion Picture and Television Fund, and the home, so many stories about Hollywood's golden age would never have come down to us, because there wouldn't have been a place to go to talk to these people. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just the stars, old technicians and wardrobe mistresses and and you didn't have to be a marquee name to take advantage of the motion picture home. And I was lucky to talk to some of these people when I did, because they were, getting into their 90s, and these old films were at the very limit of living human memory. And so please, you're getting a lot of requests for donations, especially political donations right now. But if you can give $1, go ahead. It's easy. It's all here on the site, and you'll be doing something good.
Well done. John, I want to throw out to you that David's mentioned that how Dracula is portrayed in this novel might not seem how new readers come to it. And I'm sure you have students that find this too. And it kind of begs the question, how has he gone on to be so, how did Stoker really change the conception of vampires with Dracula? And then, but is that the reason why we have vampires the way we have now? Because he is limited in this novel.
Well, I've told people in the past, and I've written on this, that there's so much of Dracula we don't get. We don't get into his psyche or his psychology the way we do with the other characters, because we have these diary entries, these phonograph, dictations and telegrams. But with Dracula, we always have secondhand. Everything we have about him is someone transcribing what they heard him saying. Okay. And he's always in the shadows, like David was pointing out. He's always on the periphery. And that did two things. It made him this very mysterious character. With other vampire stories before Dracula, the vampires were typically always in the foreground. Even Varney, there are lengthy conversations had with him, and he becomes this person that you're constantly hearing from. Dracula's not like that. And I think that helped with the films that would follow, because they had to kind of reinvent him or give him this backstory. I kind of talk about the way that there was this book, I think in the mid to late 80s. It was The Three Little Pigs, but it was from the Big Bad Wolf's perspective. And when you get his perspective, he's like, you know what? The Three Little Pigs were mean. They were rude, and they were asking for it. And you begin to feel sorry for the Big Bad Wolf. And I'm not saying we should feel sorry for the Dracula in Stoker's novel, because we shouldn't. But that same kind of conception, I think, has allowed us to fill in the blanks. And it's why Dracula keeps morphing. Although I had this exercise with my students this week where I wanted them to take a character from Dracula up to the point they had read so far, which is near the end, and basically revamp them. And I gave each one directions. Okay, your character has to be, change the sex, do this, do that, and that's what you have to go with. And I didn't tell them which character. I just told them to pick one. And all three of my groups all did Jonathan Harker. And it baffled me. I'm like, no one wanted to do Dracula. And they were like, yeah, but we already know so much about Dracula. I'm like, do we? I'm like, I think you're thinking of the films. I'm not asking you to think of the films. I'm asking you to think of the novel. And in the novel, we don't get much about him at all. I mean, there's so much incredible stuff you can do with him. And if you couldn't do so much incredible stuff with him, then we wouldn't have a full century of 700 plus films, pornos, video games, cartoons, everything that I've got in this book right here that David wrote the introduction to, Dracula and Visual Media. It just, and plus that was published 10 years ago. And even in the last 10 years, I need to add on, additional 50, 60, 70 entries. So I think Stoker leaving out that portion of Dracula is what really helped him become this crazy thing in the 20th century. Although, as David pointed out, that because he left so much out, and because Irving was so probably vain and narcissistic, he didn't see himself enough to be this central figure, and he probably just wasn't interested.
Yeah. There's a couple questions in here I'll hit right now. Someone asked, John, where do you teach? If you want to.
Oh, yeah, sure. I teach at the SCAD Atlanta campus. SCAD stands for the Savannah College of Art and Design. And I did teach at Georgia Tech for 5 years, but now I'm at SCAD, and my courses are generally film studies courses, media studies, and literature courses and whatnot. And fortunately, my superiors are great and allow me to thematize those things around horror history or slasher or vampires or Dracula. It lets me go into this really cool stuff.
David, Jim had a question. He said that he loved V is for Vampire, and he's wondering if there's any hopes of a revised edition.
Yes, but publishers have not been amenable to the suggestion. I thought it would be a no-brainer. It would also be a hell of a lot of work. It would be a much, much bigger book.
Yeah.
You know, in the intervening years, the whole vampire thing has exploded all over the place. But I haven't given up. This might be something, a little project for my advanced old age. I don't know, but vampires live forever, so who knows? Somebody will think it's a good idea too, and we'll see if we can make it happen.
Jim also asked, is there any hope of ever seeing the publication of the original manuscript? That would be great with annotations. And that, as far as I know, we don't know if the Paul Allen estate ever wants to publish that. Although I will tell you that with there's a book out right now you can buy called Drafts of Dracula, and this is kind of the revised edition of the facsimile version of the notes from Elizabeth Miller and the very recently scholar who just passed away, Robert 18 Basang. But they put this together, and in Drafts of Dracula, they include in one of the appendices all the annotation, all the handwritten annotations in the typescript. So really, if you have a copy of Dracula and then you have all the extra added, that's at least everything that was in the typescript.
Somebody should. I don't think anybody's really any Dracula scholar. You need a Dracula scholar who is that my phone is buzzing and I'm just going to ignore it. It would be a great project, and I don't think Paul Allen has also passed, but the typescript is just sitting there on display at the museum in Seattle, and there'd be no reason for them not to cooperate with the right publisher and the right editor. But it would be a completely different kind of annotated version, because you would be presenting a facsimile next to a text where all the crossouts were visible, and it would be fascinating.
I can add something to this. I wrote Paul Allen a letter, and I know it was delivered to him because the original auctioneer of Christie's, where it did not sell, basically helped me make sure it got delivered. And I basically said, hey, whether it be me or someone else, can we do a facsimile edition of your manuscript? And I don't want the money. They can all go to charity, your choice, but it would be really valuable to us if we could have access to this. But he never responded.
Yeah.
The owner who auctioned it off, and that's how Paul got it, had at one point intended to do a facsimile edition and then sell for a ridiculous amount of money. Along with that, you get one original page of the book, which is kind of a ghastly idea.
It is. Oh my gosh, that's horrible.
And it didn't happen, and he did get nearly $1 million for it.
Although it didn't sell at auction. Like he auctioned.
No. Christie's was able to make their own deal.
Christie's had to make the deal with Paul Allen for it because it didn't sell. It didn't hit his reserve. So what is the relationship between Carmilla and Dracula? Moore asks.
David, you might be better at answering this than I am. I've read Carmilla, but it's been years. But I think you've dwelled on it further than I have.
There are so many points of correspondence. It's like Stoker reads Carmilla, and then he goes off and does a kind of a riff on it and on the characters. The most striking thing about Carmilla to most readers today is the lesbian subtext, which isn't even quite a subtext. It's kind of right there, staring out at you. Although it may not have been so apparent to readers at the time, where passionate relationships between young people of the same sex were kind of idealized and not demonized until Oscar Wilde came along. But he chose in his notes to locate it in Styria, where Le Fanu located Carmilla. He has a Van Helsing-like character with a very, very similar name in there, and we can assume that's not a total coincidence. And he was such just a vacuum cleaner of information and prose that it's hard to know what was a calculated borrowing and what just happened to get there. I think is Stoker wrote like somebody who was practicing automatic writing. He seems to have written most of his books in first drafts. I mean, Dracula is clearly the exception to that. And I think it's because he was tortured with the idea, not of what he wanted to do with the book, but writing something that would make sufficient money for him. He had just, at the time he was working on the book, he had a couple of novels rejected by London publishers, and the cash flow. He was a social climber too. It wasn't just that he had a nagging wife. They both liked the idea of living in Chelsea. They lived more lavishly than Henry Irving. If you go and look at their homes, Irving lived in some floors above a trunk shop in Mayfair, and the Stokers had arguably the most desirable corner house in Chelsea, overlooking the Thames. It's a fair bet that their financial records have not come down to us, but it sure looks like they lived to the very limit of Stoker's income and probably beyond. And how the Lyceum might have been involved in footing their lifestyle, I don't know, but it may have been the way Irving held on to him.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that, just to run back to Carmilla just briefly, one of the things that fascinates me about Carmilla is that all of that backstory that we don't get about Dracula, we get about Carmilla, and she is this fully explained. She has a long story. We kind of know all about her past life and everything, and it's almost that's the story that everybody then adds to Dracula when they adapt him, especially for the movies. But I do agree. There's so many points of contact. When you read Carmilla, you just see, things that absolutely, echo in Dracula.
There's one detail, Carmilla, that nobody's, I don't think is used elsewhere, but Carmilla's mother is kind of a serial placer of her daughter into unsuspecting homes, mm-hmm. in the way that a bird lays eggs in nests and bumps out the original occupants. It's a wonderful little metaphor, and she seems to have it down to a science.
Yeah.
And
she disappears. She's gone, and who knows where she is at the end, right? She's gone.
Oh, she'd be a great character to be revived somewhere down the line. There's this new movie version of Carmilla that was available streaming just very, very briefly.
It's supposed to come out very soon. Yeah, it did one of the film festivals, and then they got delayed because of the shutdown.
It got some very good reviews. This was the film that was announced a few years ago, and I believe the title was Styria. and it has been released as Carmilla.
Yeah.
And the Lemley Virtual Cinema had it available just for a few days, and I didn't realize it was going to disappear.
I think it's
So
19th century
very-
American South that it's set in. I'm
Hmm.
pretty sure, isn't it? Yeah. So
There's a version that the one that Meg Tilly and Roddy McDowell appeared on Shelley Duvall's anthology series,
yeah.
and it was set in the antebellum South,
Uh-huh.
and it's quite a nice. Yeah,
John, there's a-
I think people now are getting the idea, from Anne Rice to take Vampires South,
Oh yeah.
but
And George R.R. Martin, his fever dream is down south.
right, of course, yes.
John, there's a question here that we have to answer only because of where she's asking you from. This is from Alba, and she wants to know if there's any universities you'd recommend for someone interested in working in literature, media, and vampires in her PhD. She's checking things now, but I especially think we should answer it because it's 3 a.m. in Spain where she's watching from. So,
And she's asking about in Spain or in Europe.
she's checking programs to apply this fall. I think she's also she's looking wherever she can go.
Well, I could go about this, talk about this at length, but let me go ahead and just type my SCAD email address and let her contact me directly. That way it'd be more efficient, and I can talk with her about it at length, and we can have a dialogue go on. So there's my email.
Anthony, Suzanne, I don't know how long we're supposed to go. It's a little bit after 9 now, and I know that there's another panel coming up at 9:30. So should we be wrapping this up around now? You can...
Sure, if you want to go ahead and wrap it up, that you'd be fine. Well, I'm not going to cut you guys off, so you're
Okay,
fine.
we're just going to talk all night. I've got more liquor here. I can just keep drinking all night. So.
I sincerely doubt any of us are going to leave at all. You've maintained everybody. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you.
Well, with Dracula, no, we three could go on probably for a 24-hour marathon here. But since Spain came up, let me take the chance to congratulate the Sitges Film Festival, where I was one of the jurors just a few years ago, and it's an extraordinary festival. It's a big red carpet paparazzi celebration of everything fantastic and horrific and science fictional, and it's been there over 50 years. And they were concerned they were not going to be able to function, but they opened yesterday, and they opened with limited seating. They're going to 80% of seating, which really kind of makes me a little nervous. But they're doing it. They're doing a lot of it virtually, and a lot of it's streaming. But frankly, that's the way a lot of us judges saw the films, because the only way to see everything we had to look at was to go back to our rooms with our laptops and use a passcode and see these things. But it is the most wonderful. It's like dying and going to heaven, and I am so happy that with everything that's going on in Catalonia and all of the upheaval, and I read that Madrid is now going back into a very deep lockdown. My favorite film festival in the world is plunging forward, and good luck to everybody there. Wonderful people, wonderful town. It's a seaside town right outside of Barcelona, so there's plenty to visit if you want to get up there some October.
Great. Alba's very happy to hear you speaking like this about Sieges, she says. So very well done. Connecting with the audience. And here's a question that I find rarely gets touched upon. From Bob asked, what is the best illustrated version of Dracula? We're also used to talking about how Dracula is adapted in the stage or film, but other visual arts and especially illustrated editions. Do you guys have favorite illustrated versions of Dracula? It could be graphic novels too. Go ahead, David.
No, the edition illustrated by Barry Moser, who also did Frankenstein.
Yeah.
His these etchings, these engravings are just the most extraordinarily evocative depictions of Stoker's vision of Dracula. They're beautiful, and they're scary, and I wish there were more than there are. But that is the edition that you should take to your grave. I think it's
Barry Moser.
I personally tried to convince the artist Bernie Wrightson, who has now passed, to do Dracula. He did the most amazing edition of Frankenstein.
I love that. I would say for Frankenstein.
And I pleaded with him, and he just said Dracula just didn't interest him the way Frankenstein did, and so we're missing out. I can only hope that Harry Clark, who wanted to illustrate Dracula, he's the Irish illustrator who did those fantastic editions of Poe in the 1920s, but couldn't come to terms with Stoker's widow. And every time I look at one of his books, I see, that could have been part of it. Maybe there's an artist who works in a similar style who could recreate what Clark would have given us, but I think it would have been extraordinary.
John, do you have any favorite illustrated versions?
Well, I own several illustrated versions, but I can't say that I actually look at them that often. I bought them because they were nice and collectible and beautiful, and I like to have them. But I can't say that I've gone through and really begun to admire the images themselves. So after this panel, I think at some point this weekend, I'll go and look at all my illustrated versions and see if I have a personal favorite that's in my collection. But no, I can't even respond. I hate that.
I'm fond of the Edward Gorey illustrations that he did for that special edition, and then of course he designed the sets for the Broadway production that had Frank Langella. But his illustrations, and it's only a few of them. It's not heavily illustrated, which is, I think, a shame. I really would have liked that. So, but that's probably more to do with I like Gorey than I think that they're perfect adaptations. But the Barry Moser, of course, you're right, David. They're absolutely fabulous. So, any guys want to leave any closing words, maybe about Dracula's afterlife and why we're still talking about Dracula for over an hour on a Friday, about this book and this legacy and why it's continued. David?
Dracula is, I used to, early in my career as a Dracula authority, I would constantly bemoan the fact that Stoker was never given his due, and they never produced an adaptation of it that was really faithful to the novel. Even the one that had Louis Jourdan came close, but it had Louis Jourdan and his personality and reputation, attending to it. I thought he was quite good, actually, but I don't feel that way anymore, because I think Bram Stoker came up with a story that had its origins in the oral tradition of folklore, in which the story was constantly changing and evolving. If you have the time, go back and look at how many different versions of Little Red Riding Hood there are, and this is just part of what this stuff is. And the novel Dracula was kind of a rest stop. I think the story took temporary shape in the printed word, and then with the 20th century and the moving image, once again, immediately when people started adapting it, they started adding their own improvements. And it's not sacrilege. It's how this damn thing stays alive. Dracula survives in his transformations. And some of them are really interesting. Some of them are awful. But it takes you back to the original book, always. many novelists have had the experience of having terrible movies made out of their books, and they're always said, well, the book is still there if people want to read it. That may be cold comfort, but folklore is a living thing, and make no doubt about it. The movies, digital storytelling. This is all folklore. This is an extension of what they were doing in the Middle Ages, and we're still doing it, and we're still evolving it.
Yeah. We seem to have lost John, and perhaps his connection went. I'm just trying to stall a little bit so he can jump back on and at least say goodbye. But he's gone right now. And I want to say that doing this 27-week, one chapter a week, deep dive that I've done in the Dracula has been revelatory to me, in that I knew I could talk about it and that I was interested in it, but what I find every week doing this deep dive into a chapter is I'm still taken aback. Like, there's so much in this that it's so rich. It's so kind of complex, at least the ideas about how Stoker's approaching it and what this monster is and how these people relate to it. And I'm utterly fascinated. And I think that because it is such a rich novel that had been ignored for so long by people who wanted to, do deep readings of it.
I think Stoker wasn't writing a book as much as he was steering an iceberg, where there was so much beneath the surface that he was not consciously directing a lot of this. He was having second thoughts about things and and I think that's where he got into trouble, because maybe his initial instincts would have been better. And there are mysteries about Dracula we will never have the answers to. And but we have a pretty engrossing story.
We do.
And a fascinating character, and he's now in his third century.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt he's gonna become as old as the Count himself. He will get into, he will reach age 500, and people will still know who Dracula was or is, even if the book is no longer being read. If people are not reading books at all, some version of this character will survive.
Yeah. Jim mentions briefly that have you guys seen this? The Beehive Books version of Dracula: The Evidence. I absolutely know about this because it is Josh O'Neill who is making this version right now, is one of my co-hosts on Sundays with Dracula. And it's a version where he's creating real, hold in your hand objects for everything in the novel. So it's all of the journals. It is the one concession he didn't make. He doesn't have actual cylinder recordings. He's doing them on vinyl that you can play.
That's
a complete
acceptable substitution. Yes.
Every word of the book in the form that it was originally in for the characters in the novel. So it's a tremendous edition that will come out. Speaking of illustrated editions, that's extra illustrated is what they call that.
I look forward to that. Do we know how many people we had joining us tonight?
We were in the upper 30s. And there's
thank you all if you're still there. This is great. Usually this time of year I'm on the road going to convention. I was looking forward to Monsterama. I was looking forward to teaching a master class in Dracula at the University of Santiago in Chile, and which of course has been massively hit by the epidemic.
And remind us, there's also an audience on YouTube too. So it's not just watching us on Zoom. We have a whole YouTube audience as well.
Well, we will give this a plug and and it will be available archived for people to access. So hello, no matter when you're seeing this, thanks for being with us, and thanks for supporting Monsterama, one of my favorite conventions. And don't forget about the Motion Picture and Television Fund. And I don't think any of you have to be told to remember Dracula. He'll remember himself for you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Yes, donate to the Motion Picture Television Fund. A farewell from John as well. I'm sure he lost his connection. That's why he's not here to say goodbye. So I appreciate everyone coming. Please tune in to Sundays with Dracula every Sunday now till November 8th. I'm still running it. And then there's plenty of Dracula content available, especially virtually from the Rosenbach. I think by the end of Sundays with Dracula, I will have created almost 100 hours of virtual content from the show and other things as well. So
we're binging on, everybody.
Yes. Good night.